Democracy. Democracy is the idea that the people should decide who runs the country. You vote, the majority wins, the winner governs, and if they do a bad job, you vote them out next time. Simple, clean, intuitive. In practice, it gets messier. Democracy requires an informed population making rational decisions, which assumes a lot about people. Campaigns cost enormous amounts of money, which means the people funding the campaigns tend to have more influence than the people casting the votes. Politicians spend half their time trying to get elected and the other half trying to stay elected, which doesn't leave a lot of time for actually governing well. It also moves slowly. Getting anything done requires convincing enough people, building coalitions, compromising until the original idea barely resembles itself, which is frustrating when you need something done quickly and kind of reassuring when the thing being done quickly would be terrible. The honest summary of democracy is that it's the system with the most complaints and the longest line of people trying to get into the countries that use it, which tells you something. Monarchy. Monarchy is when one person runs everything and that person got the job because of who their parents were. King, queen, emperor. The title changes, but the idea is the same. Power passes through blood. For most of human history, this was just how things worked. The logic made sense at the time. A stable bloodline means no power vacuum and no civil war. Every time a leader dies, continuity. Whether the king was good or terrible was kind of secondary to the fact that everyone knew who was in charge. Most modern monarchies have quietly become decorative. The UK has a king who opens parliament and appears on stamps but doesn't actually run the country. The real decisions happen elsewhere. These are called constitutional monarchies, and they basically kept the crown as a national symbol and outsourced the actual governing to people who had to earn the job. The absolute monarchies, where the king genuinely decides everything, still exist in a few places and are mostly exactly as unpleasant as you'd expect when one person has total power and inherited it at birth. Timeline of relevance: thousands of years as the dominant system, now mostly ceremonial in the places that kept it and gone in the places that didn't. Republic. A republic is often confused with democracy, and the difference is subtle but real. In a democracy, the people vote directly on decisions. In a republic, the people vote for representatives, who then make the decisions on their behalf. The logic is that governing a large country through direct votes on every issue is not practical. You can't ask 300 million people to weigh in on every piece of legislation, so you elect people whose job it is to pay attention and decide for you. Theoretically, they represent your interests. Practically, they represent whoever funded their campaign and whoever they'll need to work with after they leave office. Most countries that call themselves democracies are technically republics. The United States is a republic. Most of Europe is full of republics. The difference matters more in political science classes than in daily life, but it explains a lot about why voting for someone and then watching them do the opposite of what you expected is a feature of the system rather than a bug. Dictatorship. A dictatorship is when one person has total control and there's no real mechanism to remove them, short of them dying or being overthrown. Dictators usually don't start by announcing they're dictators. They tend to arrive through a crisis, a war, an economic collapse, a period of chaos, and present themselves as the strong solution. They consolidate power gradually. The press gets restricted, political opponents get arrested or exiled. Elections either stop happening or keep happening, but somehow the same person always wins by 90-something%. The thing about dictatorships is that they can move fast. No debates, no coalitions, no opposition to negotiate with. If the dictator is competent and has decent intentions, this occasionally produces results. History has a small handful of examples of this going okay for a period of time. History has a much larger collection of examples of it going catastrophically wrong, because the system has no correction mechanism. When a democratic leader makes bad decisions, you vote them out. When a dictator makes bad decisions, the bad decisions just continue until something breaks. Timeline to things going wrong varies, but the track record is not good. Communism. Communism is the idea that private ownership of things like factories, land, and businesses is the root of inequality, and that if society collectively owned everything and shared the output equally, nobody would be poor and nobody would be exploited. On paper, it's a response to a real problem. In the early industrial era, workers were being paid almost nothing to work in brutal conditions, while the people who owned the factories got enormously wealthy. Communism looked at that situation and said the ownership structure itself is the problem. In practice, every large-scale attempt at communism in the 20th century ended up with a small group of people at the top controlling everything on behalf of the people, while the actual people had very little say in anything. The Soviet Union, Maoist China, Cuba, the pattern repeated. The theory said power would belong to everyone. The reality was power concentrated faster than it ever had before, just in different hands. The honest assessment is that the idea has genuine appeal, and the execution has been, historically, a disaster, which is either an argument against the idea or an argument that nobody has done it right yet, and people have been arguing about which one it is for about 100 years. Socialism. Socialism often gets confused with communism, but they're different things. Communism wants to eliminate private ownership entirely. Socialism is more flexible. It generally means the government takes a strong role in managing key parts of the economy, like healthcare, education, and utilities, while still allowing private businesses to exist. Most of Western Europe runs on some version of this. You can own a business, make money, get rich, But there's also universal health care, free or cheap education, strong worker protections, and a safety net that catches you if things go wrong. The government takes more in taxes and provides more in services. The debate is essentially about where the line goes, how much should be publicly managed, how much should be left to private markets, and who decides. Every developed country in the world is somewhere on this spectrum. The argument is about where exactly on the spectrum you should be, not whether to be on it at all. Socialism is less of a fixed system and more of a dial, and different countries have it set to different levels. Fascism. Fascism is extreme nationalism combined with total state control, usually built around a single powerful leader, and the idea that the nation or the race is more important than any individual within it. It emerged in Europe in the early 20th century as a response to the chaos after World War I. Italy under Mussolini, Germany under Hitler, these are the defining examples. The appeal was order, national pride, strength, and a clear enemy to blame for everything that had gone wrong. The state controls everything: the economy, the press, the military, culture. There are no real political opponents because opposing the state is treated as treason. The population is expected to be unified behind the national project, and those who aren't are dealt with accordingly. The outcomes of the two largest fascist regimes in history were World War II and the Holocaust, which is the most complete possible summary of where this system ends up. Nazism. Nazism is a specific version of fascism. Everything that applies to fascism applies here, plus an explicit ideology of racial hierarchy with the idea that certain races, specifically Jewish people, Roma, and others, were subhuman and needed to be eliminated. It is worth being clear about this separately from fascism, because it added something to the fascist framework that turned political repression into industrial genocide. 6 million Jewish people were killed. This happened within living memory. It gets its own category not because it deserves intellectual legitimacy, but because understanding what it actually was and how it actually came to power through democratic elections, economic desperation, and nationalism that escalated gradually is more useful than treating it as something that could only happen in a different, distant world. It happened here, in a modern country, with educated people. That's the part worth remembering. Capitalism. Capitalism is the system where individuals can own businesses and property, compete in a market, and keep the profits from what they produce. Prices are set by supply and demand, rather than by a government. The idea is that competition pushes quality up and prices down, and that people working in their own interests end up benefiting society as a side effect. It is by far the dominant economic system in the world today, and it has produced the highest standard of living in human history in the countries where it developed most fully. It also produced significant inequality, periodic financial crises, and a tendency to price things that people need like healthcare and housing at whatever the market will bear rather than whatever people can afford. The honest summary is that capitalism is extremely good at producing things and extremely indifferent to whether the people who need those things can access them. Every wealthy country in the world uses some version of it. Every wealthy country also puts limits on it in various ways because the pure version tends to produce outcomes that aren't politically sustainable. It's less of an ideology at this point and more of a default setting with ongoing arguments about how much to adjust it. Theocracy. A theocracy is when religious law is the law of the land, and the government either is religious leadership or derives its authority directly from religion. The logic is that if God exists and has rules, those rules should govern society. Why would you follow human-made laws when divine law is available? It's internally consistent if you accept the premise. The problems are mostly practical. Religious texts were not written as legal codes for modern societies. Interpretation is required and interpretation varies, which means someone has to have the authority to interpret, which means power concentrates in whoever controls the interpretation. In practice, this tends to be a small group of religious leaders whose decisions are difficult to challenge because challenging them can be framed as challenging God. This was the video. Leave a like if you enjoyed it and comment which form of government you think is the best, and subscribe so you don't miss the next videos.